I made a huge mistake during my bachelor party trip. My fiancée moved on, and I want her back. 5 years ago, Walt, 28 years old, made a decision that completely messed up my life. I had a lot of good things going for me at that time. I was the new guy at my company, working as an architect mostly on neighborhood planning, and I loved my job. I also had a long-term girlfriend of 3 years, Emily, 29 years old now, 24 back then, whom I had recently engaged to. I honestly thought my life was on track and nothing could go wrong. Once Emily agreed to marry me, we started planning the wedding. We weren't interested in a big traditional wedding, so we decided to elopement to a coastal city, with San Diego being the chosen destination. We told our parents and siblings they could join us if they wanted, but essentially, we were just going on a honeymoon and getting married while we were there. Since the trip was going to be relatively inexpensive, we decided to splurge on some pre-wedding activities. Instead of traditional bachelor and bachelorette parties, we planned to check off some items from our bucket lists. Emily wanted to swim with sharks, so she booked a cage dive excursion and went to Florida for a long weekend with her best friend, Maggie. My dream was to visit Thailand, a fascination that began when I was 10 years old. Emily encouraged me, mentioning that I had talked about Thailand on our first date. 6 months into our engagement, it was time for my best friend, Jorge, and me to leave on the trip. The first 3 days were fantastic. We enjoyed the beaches, visited temples, and indulged in a lot of drinking. On the third night, however, Jorge got extremely drunk. I was annoyed and tried to get him to slow down. The next day, we were supposed to go on a jungle excursion, something I was looking forward to, so I had been pacing myself to fully enjoy the trek. I woke up the next morning feeling awful with a terrible hangover. Jorge didn't want to get up and suggested we should book an excursion for the next day. I wasn't having it. I wanted to go that day. I had seen a few places advertising these excursions, and while I was out getting breakfast, I saw a guy on the side of the road offering a jungle excursion at a good price. He had a Jeep and aggressively promoted his service when he saw me looking at his sign. Despite feeling uncertain, his fluent English convinced me to go with him. The ride started fun as we drove off the main road onto off-road paths. However, things took a turn when we ended up in a remote area, and suddenly, local law enforcement pulled up. I couldn't understand much of what was being said as they searched the guy's Jeep and found a large quantity of methamphetamine. I was terrified when they took us to a small police station in the middle of nowhere. It was then that I realized he had taken me into Cambodia without my ID or passport. The cops wouldn't listen, and I had no idea what the guide was telling them. I was panicking but hoped Jorge would realize I was missing and find out where I was. I won't go into details about the next 4.5 years, but being in a Cambodian jail was like being in hell. I spent 5 months in a cell before I even saw a judge because the legal system was heavily backlogged, and there were few public defenders available, mostly in large cities. Throughout this time, I had no contact with the outside world. When I finally appeared in front of a judge, there was no interpreter, so it got delayed for another 5 months. It took 14 more months before I had my actual hearing. Fortunately, the judge was fair and dismissed my charges based on the time served. But my relief was short-lived as the prosecutor appealed the dismissal, putting me back in custody for another 28 months. It was the most devastating experience of my life to think I was finally free only to end up back in prison for so long. During my time in captivity, I had assumed that everyone back home thought I was dead since no one came looking for me. I had reached out to my family after I was arrested, but they only knew that I was going on a jungle excursion. After 52 months, I was finally released, finding myself in a country where I wasn't supposed to be. Fortunately, the embassy had a missing person file for me, and they assisted me in contacting my family. As I tried to reach out to my fiancé, a man named Mitch answered, claiming not to know Emily. Concerned, I called my mother, who was relieved to hear from me. Though she was eager to bring me back home, she avoided discussing Emily and urged me not to contact her until my return. I was heartbroken, believing that she had moved on, especially after my parents showed reluctance to speak about her. While waiting to return, my parents provided me with financial assistance and I stayed in a hotel. Despite their warnings, I yearned to contact Emily immediately. However, my parents insisted that I wait until we were back in the US. I felt certain that she had moved on, but I couldn't help hoping for a different outcome. Upon my reunion with my parents, they handed me a save-the-date card for Emily's wedding, revealing that she was engaged to someone else. I was devastated but not entirely surprised. I inquired whether my parents had maintained contact with her, and they admitted to being a significant part of each other's lives in recent years. What shocked me was the fact that my father had agreed to walk her down the aisle. Emotionally overwhelmed, I questioned their close relationship, to which my mother revealed a series of photos. Among them, there was a group picture with Emily and my family members at a table, and at the center was a boy behind a birthday cake, labeled, "Happy 4th Birthday." Staring at the photo, I felt a mix of emotions and turned to my parents for an explanation. My mother looked at me and said, That's your son, Paul, my dad's name, Walter, my name, Ryan, our last name. I made a huge mistake on my bachelor party trip, my fiancée moved on, and I want her back. Part 2. In the 2 weeks since I returned home, it feels like a lot has happened, yet nothing significant at the same time. I've been catching up on everything that's been going on here. 5 years ago, when Jorge finally got out of bed that day, he tried to call me, but I was already in custody and the officers took away my phone. He assumed I was enjoying my time and only got worried after it was dark. The next morning, my family and fiancé started panicking and reached out to Jorge. They all went to the excursion places, but no one had seen me. They alerted the authorities and spent a month searching the area. My parents even went to Thailand but with no luck. For a year and a half, they reminded Thai officials about my disappearance, without realizing I was actually in Cambodia. Meanwhile, my fiancée, Emily, discovered she was pregnant around the time I went missing, adding to the complexity of the situation. My parents supported Emily tremendously, and they grew even closer over the years. Emily's parents were also there for her, but due to their health, my mom accompanied her to many doctor appointments and was with her during delivery, as Paul arrived prematurely at 34 weeks. Luckily, he didn't have any health issues and only needed extra attention at the beginning. My parents have told me how much they needed this. Not knowing what happened to me was incredibly painful for them, and the birth of their grandson brought them much needed relief from the grief. They kept apologizing, but they didn't do anything wrong. I think they feel guilty now that they know I was out there, and they couldn't find me. Jorge has come to see me. He has apologized too many times. He's gotten married since the trip and now has 2 kids. He seems uneasy around me, and I understand that even though it's not his fault, I still feel some resentment. My brother and sister have moved on with their lives. My brother has kids now, and my sister is married. I missed all of this. I might be able to get over all of that, but it's been too much losing my fiancé and missing out on 4 years with my son. My parents have arranged for me to see a therapist. I had my first session, but I didn't know what to talk about. I was wrongfully imprisoned for 5 years, endured physical abuse and starvation, and have plenty of PTSD. My entire family thought I was dead. They even had a memorial service for me 3 years after my disappearance. I was supposed to marry the love of my life, and now she's engaged to someone else. On top of that, I have a 4-year-old son who has been raised by my replacement since he was 18 months old. He only knows this guy as dad calls him dad, and now, here I am, back from the dead, disrupting everyone else's seemingly perfect lives. I'm just venting. It's too much to handle. I still haven't spoken directly to Emily. My father went to her house the day after my return. He sat her and her fiancé, Kevin, 34M, down and told them that I had been found. Emily thought he was going to say that my body had been found, and she broke down when he corrected her. Her fiancé comforted her, and my dad said she was just silent afterward. I tried texting her, but I didn't get a reply for a whole day, just a, "I'm so sorry, I just can't right now." I haven't asked anyone about her fiancé, except that I know she's been engaged for about 2 months, and the wedding is supposed to be in 6. No one has volunteered any information at this point. Last weekend, we had plans to meet at the park. My return has disrupted the balance, and I can sense that everyone is feeling a bit uneasy. Normally, my mom looks after Paul while Emily and Kevin are at work. Most of the time, it's at my mom's place, but ever since I came back, Paul has been spending all his time at Emily's. I've heard that they're preparing him to meet me, and he knows that I'm his father. My pictures are still up at my parents' house, and I've learned that Emily always had a picture of me in Paul's room. I may not be the same person anymore, but at least I still somewhat resemble the guy in the picture. So, it shouldn't be a complete shock for him. My parents and I got to the park first. When we saw their car pull up, only Kevin and Paul got out. Emily wasn't with them. Paul ran up to my dad and hugged him. When he saw me, he sort of hesitated, then went over to Kevin. It was clear that he was nervous, and frankly, so was I, even though I was not 4 years old. The other adults tried to encourage us to talk or at least embrace, but I told them to let it go and let him go play. He perked up and ran off to the playground. Kevin came up to me and shook my hand. He said, "Sorry, Emily couldn't make it today. We were about to leave, and she broke down, telling me she wasn't ready." I just said, "I understand." After that, I went to the playground to try to bond with Paul in some way. It turns out he's really into superheroes. He pretended to be Spider-Man, and I had to be Rhino. We played tag all over the playground, and he webbed me up. He laughed and smiled, which made me feel happy. When the food was ready, I was glad to see that he liked his hot dogs just the way I do. Ketchup on one side, mustard on the other, and relish on top. I thought maybe this wouldn't be so difficult. After all. Then, to my surprise, he called Kevin, Dad. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. Kevin has been in his life for 2.5 years, he's marrying his mom, and they all live together. Despite this, it felt like a stab in the heart, and I started tearing up. I excused myself for a moment and said I was going to the grimy park bathroom. When I returned after a minute, Kevin was waiting for me. I could see my parents watching Paul from across the way. I felt instantly awkward. The last thing I wanted at that moment was a heart-to-heart with Kevin. He was taller and more built than me and had the life I was supposed to have. He simply said, "Can we talk?" I responded, "Yeah, man, what's on your mind?" Kevin began, "Look, I'm sorry for what happened to you. It's a terrible situation all around. I want to talk because I'm concerned about Emily and Paul, especially Emily. She hasn't been herself lately, and I can understand why. It took her a long time to get over you. I was the first person she dated after your incident. She cried the first time we kissed because it was different. I want you to have a relationship with your son, he's young and resilient. I grew up with 2 dads, so I know he'll be okay. I'm worried about how Emily and you will handle it if things move too fast. From a selfish point of view, I don't want anything to disrupt our life or our engagement. I love her and want what's best. I would appreciate it if you and Emily could take it slow and process everything before you meet. I've arranged for her to see a counselor. I would appreciate it if you could respect that and not pressure her or reach out to her. Let her figure things out on her own first." I was pretty annoyed listening to him. What a pretentious guy, but honestly, he did have some valid points. I didn't want to reopen all those old wounds. So, I simply replied, "Sure, man, I can do that," and walked away to join my parents and Paul. Kevin went to the dingy bathroom. When he came back, he mentioned that he and Paul were leaving. Paul surprised me by giving everyone hugs, including me. Then he called me Rhino and darted off to Kevin. As they left, I overheard him say, "Dad, can we stop for a cookie cake on the way home?" He's Dad, I'm Rhino, and this just really sucks. I made a huge mistake during my bachelor party trip. My fiancée moved on, and I want her back. Part 3. Finally, we met. We started with some texting, but it felt so impersonal that our conversations never went deep. The most we talked about was Paul and briefly shared our experiences in the Cambodian prison. In the 3 weeks between our first text exchange and our meeting, we only texted maybe 5 times. Whenever the conversation started to get heavy, one of us would end it. During that time, I did spend more time with Paul. My mother started looking after him at her place again, which gave us the chance to bond. I even had some one-on-one time with him when we went out for ice cream together one day. It's incredible how resilient kids are. He just goes with the flow of everything. He still calls me Rhino, but maybe I'll earn the "Dad" title soon. One day this past week, when Kevin came to pick up Paul, he asked to talk again. This time, he had a job lead for me, which initially made me angry. But then he explained that it wasn't exactly a job offer but more of a lead. His brother owns a construction company and is looking for an estimator. Kevin told his brother about my background as an architect, and his brother said he'd give me an interview if I was interested. He left his brother's card with me. I want to dislike Kevin, but he does seem to be a genuinely nice person, which also annoys me. His self-deprecating sense of humor quickly grows on you, even in just 5 to 10 minute interactions with him. But at the same time, that guy. I texted Emily this past Friday, and we agreed to meet for lunch the next day. I suggested this Italian place that used to be our place, but she seemed a little upset about it, and I thought she might cancel. Instead, we ended up at Applebee's. Seeing her in person, I can't even describe it. She was just as beautiful as ever. The hello hug sent shivers down my spine. I didn't want to let go and may have lingered for just a second, but I also didn't want to make it awkward. We exchanged pleasantries and small talk while ordering, and then the conversation took its first serious turn since my return. It stayed that way for the next hour as we talked. She confided in me about the difficulty of coping with my death while she was pregnant and grieving. Many days, she felt like giving up. It was heartbreaking to hear about her struggles. She often felt so lonely in our apartment that she ended up staying at her parents' or mine most nights. She kept hoping for news about me every time the phone rang, but as time passed, she started dreading it, fearing that it might be the call informing her that they had found my body. She also shared how supportive my parents and, to a lesser extent, my siblings had been. Her bond with my sister-in-law, who was also pregnant, provided some comfort during those challenging times. After our son's first birthday, my parents, of all people, talked to her about getting back out there. She realized that she had been isolating herself and living like a widow rather than a 25-year-old woman. This realization prompted her to reconnect with her friends, allowing others to babysit our son occasionally so she could go out. Around 2 months into her efforts to rebuild her life, she met Kevin. They crossed paths at a Starbucks, where he kindly paid for her coffee and muffin and gave her his business card with his cell number. They hit it off and eventually started dating. 4 months later, she introduced Paul to him. A year later, they moved in together, and recently, they got engaged. This is the point at which her story and mine diverge. I poured my heart out to her, telling her that I still loved her and that it was incredibly difficult for me to see her with someone else. When I was in prison, the thought of reuniting with her was one of the few things that kept me going. She started to cry, and I instinctively took her hand. I asked her if there was any chance of us trying again, although looking back, I realized this might have been selfish of me. She shook her head and confessed, "I love you, I never stopped, but I also love Kevin, and I'm going to marry him. It's not fair, I know it's not fair. You didn't do anything wrong, but I had to move on. I spent years thinking you had died. When you came back, I was overjoyed, but also filled with guilt." I interrupted her, saying, "You have nothing to feel guilty about. I messed up and lost everything. I always knew you would probably move on, and I don't blame you for that. I was gone, and there was no reason for you to expect me to come back. But I did dream that I'd find my way back to you, and you'd be waiting for me. I realize now that was unrealistic. I'm sorry for putting you in this position now." She replied, "It's okay, I knew this day would come eventually." After that, we fell into a heavy silence, just sipping on our drinks. After what felt like an eternity, she asked me, "What are your intentions regarding Paul?" I assured her, "I already love him and want to be a part of his life." She smiled and said, "I'm so glad to hear that. I always told him about you because I didn't want him to feel abandoned." I declared, "He's the one positive thing in all of this mess." She then informed me that Kevin had planned to adopt Paul once they were married but wouldn't do so now that I've returned. I'm listed as the father on Paul's birth certificate, but I think I'll consult a lawyer to ensure everything is legally in place. We arranged to meet later in the week with Paul. She wanted him to have fun with all his parents at the same time and encouraged me to spend more one-on-one time with him. When we bid farewell, we hugged one last time before parting ways. When I got back to my parents' house and settled into my room, I couldn't hold back the flood of emotions. The finality of it all overwhelmed me. However, after composing myself, I made a firm decision not to dwell in my sorrow any longer. I realized it was time to set my ego aside and focus on rebuilding my life. The next day, I reached out to Kevin's brother and had an interview on the spot. He offered me the job. This was the first step in moving forward. Stay tuned for part 4. I can remember the text you provided. So after meeting Emily for the first time, I felt the need to move forward with my life. I landed a job as an estimator for Kevin's brother Kyle's 36M construction company. Things were going smoothly, and at around the 2-month mark, Kyle, aware of my background as an architect, started requesting designs for some of his custom builds, preferring them over the usual architect's work. While I continued my job as an estimator, I ended up solely designing custom homes for Kyle, and he even gave me a significant raise. This allowed me to move into my apartment, and I'm grateful to say that I'm no longer living with my parents. As for Emily and Kevin's wedding plans, there was one significant change. My father was no longer going to walk her down the aisle, as it was considered inappropriate given my return. Her much older brother, who is 16 years older than her, was going to take on that role instead. After our first lunch, I started seeing Emily more frequently, and we made it a point to do something together with Paul at least once a week. Kevin was also there, but they kept their couple behavior to a minimum. It was enjoyable, and I particularly liked spending time with Emily and being around her. However, when the back-to-school season approached, things changed. The screen printing industry became extremely busy during this time, and Kevin was swamped with work. As a result, Emily, Paul, and I ended up spending much more time together as a trio. During this period, we grew much closer. Hello side hugs turned into lingering full front hugs, and Emily and I had in-depth conversations about various topics, reminiscent of when we first started dating. After a couple of months, Kevin began rejoining our group, but that didn't deter Emily and me from rekindling our friendship. Then something remarkable happened. Paul started calling me Dad. It brought tears to my eyes the first 10 times he did so. Life went on for the next couple of months. A week before the wedding, I had initially decided not to attend, and my parents were only guests. However, that weekend, they decided to have partially combined bachelorette parties. They planned to have dinner with friends, engage in activities, karaoke for her, Topgolf for him, and then meet up at a bar or club around 11 p.m. I wasn't part of any of these plans and had no idea where they were going to end up. Feeling a bit down, I decided to go out that night instead of just staying in my apartment. It was tough for me as it was another reminder that I had lost her to someone else, no matter how great of a guy he was. It was around 10:30 that night. I was a bit buzzed and planned to get an Uber to go home when Emily and her bachelorette crew walked in. I initially tried to blend into the crowd, not wanting to intrude on her night, but she spotted me. Emily came over and we started chatting. It got a little flirty. Then, a song she liked came on and she started dancing, and then she started dancing with me. I joined in, and we were just laughing and having a good time. When the song ended, she kind of tripped into me, and I caught her. We looked at each other, our faces getting close, and we almost kissed, but then she pulled back. We just laughed it off and went to the bar to get a drink. It's a good thing we didn't kiss because, about 2 minutes later, Kevin showed up. I noticed that he wasn't quite himself, so when they kissed, I felt like a third wheel and decided to call an Uber to head home. The next day, I woke up feeling a bit hungover and decided to sleep in on my lazy Sunday. Around midday, I heard someone trying to open my door, but it was locked. They started knocking loudly, so I rushed to open the door. It was Emily, and she hugged me tightly and kissed me. It was the most amazing feeling I had ever experienced, even though it was confusing. I asked her what was happening, and she explained that Kevin had come to talk to her in the morning and they had decided to end things. She admitted her feelings for me were still strong, and he understood and decided to step away. She reassured me that she would explain everything one day when she was ready. She had already packed her and Paul's bags, and they moved in with me the same day. The following day, my father went to see Kevin. He looked a bit hungover and had taken the day off. They had a conversation, and my dad tried to be understanding as Kevin had been a big part of our lives. He inquired of Kevin what his plans were. Kevin admitted he was unsure beyond trying to recoup some deposits. My father offered to reimburse Kevin and take over the reservations. Without asking why, my father thought Kevin understood. While this was happening, I had to go to work and confront Kyle. Upon my arrival, he called me into his office. As I sat down, Kyle began, "Let me speak my mind. I'm upset, but my brother advises me to move on, and I will. Although I want to vent my anger on you, I won't. My brother and I learned a tough lesson in high school about revenge, and we vowed to be the bigger men going forward. But that's a story for another time. We should go our separate ways, my family needs time to heal. However, I won't leave you stranded. You will have a week off with pay, during which time I want you to meet with a friend of mine, Lee. He also runs a construction company and has agreed to hire you at your current salary. I remember the day vividly. It's commercial, not residential, but you'll manage just fine," he said as I stood up to thank him, only to be stopped in my tracks. "This isn't for you, it's for Kev. Now, gather your things and get out of here," he added. I reached out to Lee that same day, and he confirmed I could start in 2 weeks. When my father returned saying he now had control of the wedding accommodations, Emily and I exchanged glances, realizing we both wanted this. It wasn't the beach wedding we had always dreamed of. In fact, it was Kevin who wanted the traditional ceremony. In the end, though, he was right, we had an amazing time. Jorge was my best man, and she looked stunning in her dress. Organizing a tux rental on short notice was quite a headache, but it all worked out in the end. While neither of us had large friends or family groups, it was comforting to celebrate with those who had supported us through the tough times. It's been a month since our wedding. I still find it hard to believe. Paul had a bit of trouble adjusting and does miss Kevin, but he seems happier this past week. Considering where I was and where I am now, I can only feel incredibly fortunate. Hello everyone, your support means the world to me. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube channel and turning on notifications to stay updated on our latest content. Thank you so much for your support and I can't wait to see you in the next video.